A deep analysis of love and human psychology conducted by Carl Jung helps us understand the fundamental dynamics of relationships. In this video, we will talk about the reasons why people fall in love with you from Carl Jung's perspective. According to Carl Jung, people fall in love for two main reasons. One, to compensate for their own shortcomings, a mechanism of projection, and two, familiar desires, archetypes, and subconscious modeling. First, let us explain the first reason. First, compensating for one's own shortcomings, a mechanism of projection. We will consider this first main reason in four sections. First, the reflection of the shadow. In Carl Jung's psychology, the shadow represents those aspects of a person's personality that he drives into the subconscious, finds difficult to accept, or suppresses. By its nature, a person strives to feel whole and balanced. However, traits that a person lacks in character or that he subconsciously rejects create a strong attraction when they manifest in other people in the outside world. This is where love comes into play. The person we fall in love with may actually be a reflection of those aspects of ourselves that we consciously do not recognize or are not aware of. This is why a sudden and strong interest in someone often arises because our unconscious shadow parts resonate in the external world, and not because of their real characteristics. The shadow projection mechanism causes a person to see their own shortcomings in others. For example, an introvert who feels uncomfortable in social situations may fall in love with an extrovert, an energetic and self-confident person. In fact, however, this reflection does not always have a positive effect. Sometimes a person may project onto another person those negative aspects of himself that he has suppressed and does not want to accept. At the beginning of love, the projection mechanism works intensely and a person sees another person as a magical being. The person he falls in love with becomes someone ideal, whole, and extraordinary in his eyes. However, over time, disappointments may arise when this projected shadow begins to disappear and the real person appears because the person can no longer try to compensate for the missing aspects in his subconscious through his partner. It is at this moment that the relationship either grows into a deeper connection or begins to collapse. True love begins at the moment when the projection ends and the partner is accepted for who he really is. One of the greatest mechanisms of love is the reflection of the shadow. A person turns to others to compensate for the missing or suppressed aspects within himself and often finds a reflection of his own subconscious in the person he falls in love with. However, love experience without achieving this awareness often remains superficial and may turn into disappointment over time. Jung's approach helps us understand love not only as an emotional experience, but also as a deep psychological process. If a person wants to understand why he falls in love, whom he chooses, and why he must first recognize his own shadow and bring it to the level of consciousness, because true love begins where projections end. 2. The projection of anima and animus. One of the most important concepts of love developed by Carl Jung are the concepts of anima and animus, which represent the spiritual reflection of the opposite sex that a person carries within himself. According to Jung, every man carries a feminine side, the anima, in his subconscious, while every woman carries a masculine side, the animus, in her subconscious. This is a universal part of human psychology, playing a huge role in shaping love. People feel an unconscious attraction to people whose characteristics correspond to their anima or animus, and often they do not even realize this. This attraction underlying love is actually a desire to achieve inner wholeness. The anima embodies the feminine aspect of the male psyche. According to Jung, when a man cannot fully accept the feminine feelings and intuition that he carries within himself, he creates a powerful image of the anima in his subconscious. This image is often based on the image of the mother in childhood and, over time, shapes the perception of women. If in childhood a man had a caring, understanding, and compassionate mother, then throughout his life he may be attracted to women with these qualities. However, in the opposite case, that is, if his mother has a cold, detached, or critical character, then the man may be subconsciously inclined to be attracted to such women. In fact, he is looking for an unresolved emotional dynamic in the woman he loves that he experienced in relation to his mother, and subconsciously forms relationships in accordance with these models. Similarly, the animus is the unconscious masculine aspect of women, and this aspect determines their perception of men. The animus in a woman's subconscious is often a reflection of her father or influential male figures who influenced her in childhood. If a woman grew up with an authoritarian, strong, and caring father figure, then in the future, she may be attracted to men with such characteristics. However, if her father was indifferent or emotionally detached, a woman may find that she is drawn to men who are emotionally detached. This happens because the animus in the subconscious is trying to compensate for those aspects that are lacking in the internal world of a person. The projection of anima and animus plays a big role in relationships. Sometimes it shows that a person sees the person he is in love with through these projections from his subconscious and not in his true form. When a man falls in love with a woman, he is actually attracted to her correspondence to his subconscious image of the anima and not her physical or character traits. This also applies to cases when a woman falls in love with a person corresponding to her animus. This is why people sometimes belong to a certain type and subconsciously gravitate towards people with similar characteristics. The main reason for this is the image of the ideal partner that is subconsciously formed by the anima or animus in the internal world of a person. However, this projection does not always work well. A person may idealize the person he is in love with and attribute to him or her meanings that he does not actually possess. According to Jung, true love begins only when the projection of anima and animus ends. A person can build a healthy relationship when he or she can accept another person as he or she is and does not try to compensate for his or her own unconscious shortcomings through his or her partner. Otherwise, love will become just an illusion and may end in disappointment. As the relationship develops, to understand why people fall in love with certain people, they should first study the concepts of anima and animus in their own internal world. Only when this awareness is achieved can love cease to be a search for completion and become a connection in which two people truly accept each other. 3. Searching for a path to complete unfinished psychological development. Human psychology, by its nature, is in constant search for development and improvement. According to Carl Jung, personality is formed under the influence of various experiences, starting from childhood, and some psychological aspects cannot fully develop in the course of this process. Missing aspects create a void in a person's internal world, and the desire to fill this void is often reflected in love relationships. People unconsciously fall in love with someone who will complement those character traits that they consider insufficient or weak in themselves. Love is not just an emotional connection, but also an attempt to heal psychological shortcomings at a subconscious level. To complete his unfinished psychological development, a person subconsciously chooses a partner who embodies these aspects or provides him with the opportunity to develop them. A person who has been emotionally neglected at a young age may fall in love with a person who shows him great interest and constant love. However, this type of love can turn into an addiction aimed at satisfying a need that was absent in childhood and not a healthy emotional connection. An individual becomes attached to his partner not only because he loves him, but also because he expects psychological satisfaction from him. This can lead to an imbalance in the relationship, as love begins to be seen as a kind of therapeutic process. Some people in childhood may have been raised by overly protective parents. Since these people cannot fully develop their independence, they are attracted to independent and strong personalities in life who can free them. A person who finds it difficult to make independent decisions or lacks self-confidence may fall in love with a decisive and courageous person because he subconsciously feels that this person will guide him and make up for his shortcomings. But here too, there is a risk. If a person becomes completely dependent on his partner, the relationship can lead to a loss of individuality and not to a healthy development process. The desire to complete unfinished psychological development is not limited to emotional aspects only. It also encompasses the missing aspects of a person's personality structure. For example, a person who lacks discipline and order may be attracted to a person living in a planned and organized manner. A person who finds it difficult to express his feelings may fall in love with a person who expresses his feelings openly and freely. Although such relationships may seem harmonious at first glance, over time, they may lead to a person becoming completely dependent on his partner instead of correcting his own shortcomings. However, real psychological growth is possible when a person completes his own development, receiving support from his relationship partner. According to Jung, a person's psychological development is a lifelong process, and love is one of the most important catalysts for this process. True love is a process in which we grow together with our partner, recognizing and correct. One of the reasons why people fall in love is an internal desire to complete their unfinished psychological development. Shortcomings, suppressed emotions, and underdeveloped aspects experienced in childhood shape love relationships at a subconscious level. However, true psychological maturity is possible when a person achieves this development in his own internal world and not tries to compensate for these shortcomings at the expense of someone else. From Jung's point of view, love is not only an emotional connection, but also a mirror helping a person to complete his psychological development. If we can consciously live love in this way, then love can become not just an addiction born of need, but a deep and meaningful experience that helps a person realize himself. 4. Idealization and the search for perfection. According to Carl Jung's psychological theory, people perceive love as a process of idealization designed to compensate for the missing or incomplete aspects of their subconscious. In this process, the person you fall in love with is perceived not as he really is, but as an idealized image created in the person's mind. People often unconsciously begin to see the person they are in love with as an ideal, flawless, and complementary figure. This is a reflection of a person's internal desires, aspirations, and subconscious need for satisfaction. However, over time, such idealization can create illusions about the nature of love and lead to serious disappointments in the later stages of the relationship. The idealization mechanism works especially intensely in the early stages of love. A person tends to consider his partner extraordinary and either does not notice or consciously ignores his shortcomings. In this process, the partner becomes a sacred figure and is perceived as an essence that compensates for the shortcomings of a person's internal world. But here love becomes a kind of mental projection and not a real connection. A person seeks perfection in his partner that he cannot achieve himself, and therefore wants him to be complete and flawless. However, no one is perfect, and over time, this idealized image begins to collapse. This search for perfection is directly related to the perception of a person formed in childhood. People who idealized a parent or role model, especially in childhood, experience love according to a similar pattern in adulthood. For example, if a child sees one of his parents as great, powerful, and capable of overcoming everything, in the following years he may look for a similar figure in his personal life. He develops a subconscious belief that his partner should be ideal, and he makes the appropriate choice. However, this makes it difficult to build a healthy relationship because true love requires accepting shortcomings and loving a person for who he is. Another aspect of the idealization process is that love is perceived as an experience filled with strong emotions. A person begins to see not only his physical or character traits in the loved one, but also the means of spiritual improvement. This is why love can become not just a romantic connection, but also a spiritual quest. A person is trying to find inner peace, happiness, and meaning in life in his partner. However, this form of love is not sustainable because a person is completely dependent on an external source of his happiness. As soon as the partner reveals any shortcomings or does not live up to expectations, there is a strong disappointment. At this moment, love may suddenly end because the idealization mechanism has collapsed and a real person has appeared. The desire for perfection is a reflection of a person's attempt to avoid his internal shortcomings, and often people want to maintain this illusion. However, true love is not born from seeing someone as perfect, but from accepting him in all his aspects. People do not just fall in love with someone. More often than not, they fall in love with the ideal image created by them in the subconscious. When this idealized love eventually collides with reality, difficulties begin to arise, and the nature of their relationship changes. But from Jung's point of view, the true meaning of love manifests itself when we stop seeing the other person as a projection of our internal world and instead accept him in all his aspects. At this moment, love ceases to be an effort to achieve a goal and becomes a journey helping a person realize himself. Now let us explain the second main reason: desires, familiar archetypes, and subconscious modeling. We will consider this main reason by dividing it into 4 sections. First, the role of archetypes and their place in human psychology. According to Carl Jung, archetypes are the fundamental building blocks of human psychology and represent universal images or patterns arising from the depths of the unconscious. Jung defines archetypes as fundamental forms of human experience that are historically and culturally universal and are located in the collective unconscious of man. These archetypes have manifested in similar forms throughout human history, from the past to the present, and have shaped the internal world of people. Archetypes influence not only individual life experiences, but also the structures of societies and cultures. These universal images act as a kind of template deep within human psychology. They represent a kind of hidden pattern that guides people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and allows them to establish a connection with their conscious and unconscious processes. The place of archetypes in a person's internal world is very deep, thanks to their connection with both conscious and unconscious processes. According to Jung, these archetypes symbolize important figures and events in a person's life. Each person interacts with these universal archetypes to develop internal understanding and reveal his own identity. According to Jung, the process of human development becomes possible thanks to the surfacing and integration of suppressed and unconscious aspects, such as the shadow archetype. Archetypes help people understand the meaning of life, themselves, and their relationships with others. Each archetype gives a kind of guidance and directs a person in his internal journey. The role of archetypes in love and relationships is one of Jung's deepest and most significant contributions to the theory. People look for archetypes that they subconsciously possess in their partners. According to Jung, these archetypal images play a big role when people choose who to fall in love with. When choosing a lover, each person pays attention not only to external attractiveness, but also to archetypal characteristics that will complement the missing or incomplete aspects of the unconscious. People unconsciously turn to archetypal figures to compensate for those aspects of their personality that they lack, to regain lost self-confidence, or to heal emotional wounds of the past. Therefore, if the person you fall in love with corresponds to the archetypal images in a person's subconscious, this person becomes extremely attractive and desirable. The place of archetypes in human psychology is one of the cornerstones of Jung's theory. Archetypes are structures that occupy a universal place in a person's unconscious and guide his internal world, shaping a person's thoughts and behaviors. Archetypal images also play a big role in people's relationships and love life. People subconsciously look for archetypal figures in their partners that will complement their missing or unfinished aspects, and these figures symbolize their emotional needs. However, under the influence of archetypes and projections, people sometimes idealize the person they are in love with and see in him reflections of their internal desires, and not as he really is. Therefore, according to Jung, love can become healthy only through awareness and a deep connection with a real person. 2. The guidance of unconscious attraction to the familiar. According to Carl Jung's theories, a person's unconscious represents a deep structure largely shaped by past experiences, social models, and internal archetypes. This unconscious carries not only individual memory but also universal symbols and the experience of human history. Even if people do not realize this, unconscious models constantly influence their lives and guide it. One of these interactions is directly related to how love and attraction develop between people. According to Jung, people are drawn to things that make them feel familiar and safe. The attraction of the familiar arises under the guidance of the unconscious, and people try to establish it. These structures determine how a person looks at the world, how he approaches relationships, and who he wants to be close to. The search for love and care in childhood leads to a person subconsciously striving for secure attachment and familiar figures in later years. Jung's concept of the shadow also occupies an important place here. Sometimes people project emotional needs, fears, or shortcomings that they themselves do not even suspect onto others. These projections are similar to the attraction to familiar figures in the subconscious. A person can project these projections onto his partner to compensate for his or her unconscious emotional shortcomings, making him or her more attractive and familiar. Various myths, legends, and cultural symbols in the history of mankind support archetypes, and people establish an internal connection with these social models. For example, when men are depicted in society as strong, leading, and protective figures, this may lead to people subconsciously striving for such figures. Similarly, for women, there are images of caring and protective mothers in the collective unconscious of society. These social archetypes influence individuals' choice of partners. People are drawn to familiar figures determined by society and culture because these figures give them a sense of belonging, safety, and recognizability. The attraction to these familiar figures at a subconscious level is often a reflection of a person's emotional and psychological needs. People tend to gravitate towards those figures that evoke a sense of peace and security in them. This attraction may be based solely on past experience or be a consequence of the collective unconscious. For this process to function normally, Jung recommends that people become aware of their internal world, recognize the projections of the unconscious, and accept these projections. Otherwise, the attraction to partners, in order to compensate for unconscious shortcomings, can lead to idealization and misleading projections. This can bring false expectations and disappointments into the relationship. The attractiveness of the familiar, guided by the unconscious, has a profound influence on how people form love in relationships. People are drawn to familiar archetypal figures to fill in the gaps in the subconscious, fill the emotional void, and create a safe space. The familiar, combined with trust and a sense of belonging, creates a connection that people feel deep down but do not realize. However, this connection can be established on a healthy basis only if a person is aware of the projections in his subconscious and establishes a healthy relationship. 3. Reflection on the desire for something familiar in relationships. According to Carl Jung, love and relationships are not only the result of external interaction, but also a reflection of deep psychological processes. The way people choose their partners is formed under the influence of a strong attraction to archetypal figures in their subconscious. The desire for something familiar often reflects a person's search for subconscious needs that can be satisfied in a relationship. But this process can also lead to complex and sometimes problematic dynamics. The attractiveness of the familiar in the subconscious is often based on a person's childhood experiences and attachments in early age. In childhood, people often develop a sense of emotional security and belonging through relationships with mothers, fathers, or caregivers. These early attachments leave indelible marks on a person's subconscious. A person may subconsciously want to compensate for the shortcomings and emotional wounds that he experiences during this period through a partner with whom he is in a relationship. The desire for something familiar sometimes makes people idealize their relationships. When people look for partners who will compensate for the shortcomings they subconsciously feel, they may develop a belief that these partners are ideal. The attraction to something familiar can also lead to people reliving the pain they experienced in past relationships. Jung argues that people tend to relive unresolved emotional problems in the subconscious in the same way, the desire for something familiar is actually a desire to experience something again. This can also be seen as people's attempts to resolve emotional turmoil in their past relationships. One of the most important manifestations of the desire for something familiar in relationships is the strong emotional connection that people develop with their partners. This connection is formed not only by physical attraction, but also by the desire to establish a deep connection on an emotional and psychological level. When people look for a partner who will compensate for their unconscious shortcomings, they are actually trying to find their own identity. This process is the anima represents the feminine side of a man, while the animus represents the masculine side of a woman. These figures allow a person to strive for familiar relationships with the opposite sex. The unconscious idealization of the figures of anima or animus can lead to the establishment of strong emotional connections in relationships. The desire for the familiar is formed both by the desire to establish a deep connection in relationships and by the desire to compensate for unconscious shortcomings. In this search, which relies on past experiences, childhood connections, and social archetypes, people are drawn to familiar figures in their partners. However, this process can also face problems such as idealization, projection, and the preservation of the traces of the past. According to Jung, healthy relationships should be based on awareness of these unconscious influences and on a connection with the true personality of the partner. The attraction to the familiar can contribute to the development of relationships on a deep and meaningful level, but it is important for a person to consciously guide this attraction. Otherwise, the relationship may remain limited to patterns created by the past, which may prevent people from forming real connections. 4. Attachment to the familiar and psychological development. Carl Jung's psychological theories are of great importance for understanding how a person's internal world and his subconscious shape his relationships with the external world. When people subconsciously strive for something familiar, this search represents not only an emotional and physical attraction, but also an important turning point in the psychological development of the individual. Attachment to the familiar reflects a person's desire for balance in the internal world, for completeness and psychological maturation. This attachment is a means of emotionally satisfying one's subconscious shortcomings, wounds, or incomplete archetypal figures. However, this process not only encourages the search for emotional security, but also promotes personal growth and internal transformation. Attachment to familiar figures in the unconscious begins as a search for security. People perceive the connections they form with their parents in childhood as a kind of basic sense of trust. People try to fill emotional gaps in the past by connecting with the familiar in their subconscious. Although at first glance this may seem like a simple recurring experience, in fact it is the beginning of a deep process of psychological development. By rediscovering in one's partner familiar figures from one's own past, a person gains the opportunity to heal emotional relationships with these figures. Attachment to the familiar allows a person to develop a more holistic and mature identity. Attachment to the familiar also triggers the process of establishing balance in a person's internal world. By turning to familiar figures in their subconscious, people reveal their own shadows, that is, suppressed aspects and parts of themselves that they cannot accept. According to Jung, the shadow is those aspects of personality that one consciously rejects or suppresses, and these aspects can hinder a person's psychological development. However, confronting these aspects, accepting them, and achieving internal wholeness are an important part of the path of a person's growth. Attachment to the familiar can help understand and transform this shadow. Attachment to the familiar can also help people explore their personal boundaries and self-esteem. Jung's concept of self-respect implies that a person respects himself and accepts his own internal value. Attachment to familiar figures can sometimes lead to a person overstepping his boundaries and losing himself in the needs of his partner. However, this obligation also provides an opportunity to restore personal boundaries and increase self-esteem. A person can review his relationship with his partner, taking into account his own boundaries and emotional needs. This process involves establishing healthy relationships with a partner and learning how to be together without losing individuality. Strengthening the connection with a partner and simultaneously protecting one's own identity ensures that psychological development will proceed in a healthy way. Attachment to the familiar is an important opportunity for the psychological development of the individual. This obligation can become a means of compensating for emotional shortcomings of the past, accepting the shadow, achieving internal balance, and restoring personal boundaries. However, at first this process may seem difficult and complex. According to Jung's theories, psychological development becomes possible when an individual confronts unconscious figures, accepts them, and integrates them. Attachment to the familiar plays an important role in this process because it allows people to resolve deep attachments in their internal world and build a more holistic self. In this video, we discuss the reasons why people fall in love with you from Carl Jung's point of view. We believe that from Carl Jung's point of view, there may be different opinions about the reasons why people fall in love with you. What do you think is more related to personality, environmental factors, or something else? Share your ideas in the comments. Let's discuss. Also, do not forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. Your opinion is very important to us. Thank you.